All right, and that's what we covered last time. So we're about done with the Lord's Prayer and all of the different attitudes that Jesus is teaching. And I said there are 7 attitudes in the Lord's Prayer, and ultimately there are. But tonight I'm going to tag on what could be argued as an 8th attitude. So in your notes, if you even want to change the 7 attitudes of prayer title, you can. You don't have to, because this attitude here still kind of coincides with attitudes before, but Jesus finishes with this particular part of the prayer. So the 8th attitude, or at least arguably an 8th attitude of prayer that Jesus teaches, is this. It's an attitude that seeks spiritual protection for the sole purpose of remaining holy. It's an attitude that seeks spiritual protection for the sole purpose of remaining holy. So what part of the prayer are we talking about? Matthew 6, verse 13. And Jesus prays, and he actually ends the prayer in most translations with this, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. There are some manuscripts that actually have that appended, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. You won't find it in every manuscript, and the reason being is that not all of our older manuscripts have this. It's kind of hit or miss as to where it's at. And so scholars sometimes decide to leave it out and make a note in a margin that that's in some other manuscripts, and other Bibles will actually put it in there. It doesn't matter if it's there or not, if it was in the original or wasn't in the original, because all of it still, there's nothing in that ending, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever, that is unbiblical. So if it was original, it's fine. And if it wasn't original and it's not in there, at least they make a note, and usually most Bibles margins. So we're not going to cover that part because it's really more of a doxology part of the prayer. But we are going to look at this last, and we'll close off with this last verse. So, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And actually, this is what many scholars have found to be the problem verse in all of the Lord's Prayer. And I'll explain what I mean by the problem verse in a minute. Excuse me. So the reason that scholars have struggled with this, or without lack of a better term, have kind of labeled this a difficult verse or a problem verse, is for a couple of reasons that we're going to cover tonight. And then we're going to, hopefully, I'm going to attempt to clarify and biblically, soundly teach what Jesus is actually teaching here. So the first reason why this has caused some trouble throughout the years is for one of the words. There's 2 words that cause trouble, and one of the words here is the word temptation. So the word temptation that Jesus uses here is the Greek word parasmos. And depending on its use, just like a lot of English words, it can mean different things depending on how you use it. For example, in James chapter 1, verse 2, parasmos is translated trials, where James writes, "Count it pure joy, my brothers, when you face parasmos, trials of many kinds." So in this particular usage, parasmos means an attempt to learn the character or nature of something through a test or a trial. So why does James use this particular word here? Because when, as believers, we face hard times, God actually uses those moments, those difficult times, not just to help us grow in them, but to help us learn our character and our own nature. It can either showcase our maturity in Christ or our immaturity in Christ. Trials can show up where we need the most work. It can also show where we've grown. And so, as he goes on in James, and we'll look at it a little bit later, he tells why we should rejoice when we face trials because of what the trials do for us. So in this case, a trial is an attempt to learn the character or nature of something through a difficult test. Okay, so we find this is also used in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. And he writes this, "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while," he's talking about difficult times, right? "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various parasmos, trials." And he goes on, "so that the tested genuineness of your faith," remember we just talked about what trials are for, what parasmos means. It means to find the character of something through a test. He says, "so that the tested genuineness of your faith," is it real? "Which is more precious than gold, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." So what is Peter saying? He's saying the same thing. These tests are proving your character. It's showing who you are. Yes?
When you read in the King James, it still uses the word temptations, but when it goes after, when it says, "if need be, you are in heaviness through manifold temptations," that's the trial of your faith. So it explains what that temptation is, even if it didn't use the word trials. Trials is in the NIV, of course.
Yep.
And other translations, but even when it does say that, it follows up by saying trials.
Right.
And so it still uses the word trials, so you'd have to dig into it to get the Greek and get the actual.
Right. Yes?
Is the trials to show you how your character's grown or to show him?
Well, God knows. So he doesn't need a trial to test for him to see what you're like, because he knows your heart. He knows what you're going to do before you do it. It's to show you and to show the world. It's to show others. It's testing that genuineness. It's the reason why when Jesus, through John, when John was exiled onto the prison island of Patmos, and Jesus appears to him, he writes 7 letters, and they're to the 7 churches. And each church, that was one of the main 7 churches of that giant region of that day, each church got their own letter. And 5 of them had warnings. Like, some of them had, "you're doing this right, but I have this against what you're doing." And it really came down to, fix it or I'm shutting your church down, basically is what he's saying, and taking away your witness. But 2 of those churches didn't have any warnings, and Jesus had nothing but good things to say. And those 2 churches were the 2 most persecuted churches in the whole area. So what does that show us? It shows us that those trials, it's like the refiner's fire that the Old Testament talks about. And if you go to a refiner, they have to stick that like silver or that gold into the hottest part of the fire. But the entire time they're sticking it into the fire, they've got to keep their eye on it, because if they put it in too long, it will ruin the metal, the material. It'll just melt. Why do they stick it in the fire? Because they're burning off all of the impurities. They're getting rid of it. And if you were to ask a refiner of silver, how do they know when the process is done? They will tell you, as soon as I can see my reflection in the material, it's done. And this is why the Bible uses that kind of allegory, that God refines us like a refiner of purest silver. He uses trials to burn off the impurities that are in us until all he sees is his reflection in us. That's the point of the refiner's fire. And that is the point and purpose of trials. We do live in a fallen, broken world full of fallen and evil people. And so there's going to be difficulties. And the good part is that God is like, I don't allow my children to go through bad things wasted. In other words, he takes the bad and he does something with it. And that's the point of the trial. And it shows us where we need to get closer to the Lord. It shows us the growth that we've made. It shows us when we reflect God, and it shows us when we reflect ourselves. And it helps us to draw closer if we allow the trial to do so. So hopefully that answers the question. In verse 7 of 1 Peter 1, 6, and 7, "In this we greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials." And he says, "So that the tested genuineness of your faith, which is more precious than gold, that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." So he says in verse 7, he uses the word tested twice. Notice that in verse 6 it's trials, various trials, parasmos. And in verse 7 we have the tested genuineness of faith, and we have the gold that is tested by fire. Now this word tested means to examine, to determine genuineness. So it sounds a lot like parasmos. And this word is dokimazo. And while they have sort of the same outcome, they have two different purposes for being done. And let me explain this so that when we get back to the Lord's Prayer, it'll make sense as to why Jesus chose one word over the other, because either one of those could have been used depending upon the purpose of the speaker. So, in summary, what we have are two different words that can be translated as test, tried, or trial. Each have a different purpose in their use. So, parasmos is a test to determine the nature of something. Maybe it's an unknown nature, and we're testing to see, is this fool's gold or is it real gold? We have to test it. Is it pyrite or is it real gold? You do a test, right? So we don't know. But dokimazo is used when proving a claim to be true. So while they're both trying to prove the same thing, one is doing so without prior knowledge. The other is doing so when there's a claim. So if somebody was to say, and this is like how Greek works, if somebody was to say, "Oh, I got this gold, I'm going to be rich and I'll pay you in this gold," they've made a claim. So if you were to test that gold now, you would use the word dokimazo because you're testing the claim. Are you telling the truth? Is this really... You call yourself a Christian, but really? Let's see what the testing of life shows. Versus the other one, which is a test that almost kind of showcases the truth without a claim. Does that make sense? Very, very similar, but there is that difference when it's being used. Now, there is a second meaning for the word parasmos. Parasmos doesn't just always mean to determine what something is, to determine if something is genuine. A second meaning for the word parasmos is this: an attempt to make someone do something wrong. Enticement. And this is where we get the word temptation. What is temptation? Well, temptation is exactly an attempt to make someone do something they know they shouldn't do. It's an enticement to do something that, like, this is a bad decision, but it's so tempting. It could be, I don't have enough money to buy this really nice HD TV, but it's on sale. And so the temptation is, do I spend money I really don't have for this temporary pleasure, or do I wait, save up some money, and just buy it when I can actually afford it? So there's a temptation there. There is a parasmos that's happening in that moment. It is this temptation. So why is the word parasmos, temptation, in Matthew 6:13 a problem? So Jesus doesn't use dokimazo. He uses parasmos, and it either means a test or a trial to prove something, or it means an enticement to do something wrong. Why don't scholars like either one? They don't like this word here. And in the first usage, some scholars would translate this passage and lead us not into trials, into testings or trials. You will find some commentaries or even some translations that may put that in there, especially if you read a paraphrase like the New Living Translation, which isn't a translation, it's a paraphrase. And what is a paraphrase? A paraphrase is, I'm not using the Greek, I'm using the English, and I'm going to restate it. Hopefully it means the same thing, but I'm going to put it in my own words, and hopefully throughout it's going to balance with the actual meaning, but that doesn't always happen. So in some paraphrases or even some translations, you'll see things like, and lead us not into trials or testings. So why is this a problem? If the word means that, why would that be a problem? Well, because the rest of the New Testament tells us to rejoice when we are tested. Because it both proves that we belong to Christ, or it proves that we don't. And in a believer, trials produce holiness in us. So why would Jesus teach his disciples or us to pray, God, don't bring trials our way. Don't make us more holy. Don't draw us closer to you. Don't show us the truth of who we are. And yeah, nobody wants to be like, oh, bring on the trouble. That's not really what is being said here either. Because nobody prays for God to bring the hard times. The difference is when God does allow the hard times. As a believer, we know that he is using it to make us better. And that is something that believers can rejoice in. So it becomes slightly a problem area if that's what Jesus meant. So now in the second definition of parasmos, which is where we get the actual word for temptation, what is the problem here? Well, in the second usage, scholars would understand this verse like this: and do not tempt us to evil. Because the word is the word lead, and we're going to talk about the reason that's the second word that's the problem. And lead us not into temptation. So why is this a problem? Well, because James 1:13 tells us this: when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. So this is why scholars are like, what is he saying? Like, what is happening here? So, reason 2, the word lead. If the word lead wasn't in there, wasn't being used here by Jesus, it would be a little bit less of a problem, because it could translate and deliver us from temptation, which makes more sense, right? Well, the word lead is there, and that's throwing everybody off. Many Bible scholars cannot understand why Jesus uses the word lead here, as it implies it's an action, it's a verb, that God is doing the leading into temptation. But we just read that God doesn't do that. So what is Jesus talking about? What is he teaching his disciples? Because remember, this is Jesus teaching an attitude of prayer. In this way, and with these attitudes, this is how you should approach the throne. So how are we to understand what Jesus is actually saying? Well, what's really cool about this is that God is the one who invented language. And language has rules for a reason. And even in the Greek and in every other language, there are a few rules that always happen for language to function. And there is a grammatical tool or rule that we use in English, that we use in French, and most languages that are highly built up and have evolved over the years, including in Greek and in the Hebrew. We have something called a balanced sentence. Has anybody ever heard of a balanced sentence? This is a grammatical rule. You're not always taught this stuff all the time. So what is a balanced sentence? We're going to learn what that is real fast, and we're going to see how do we use this to help us understand Jesus' lingo, basically. So what is a balanced sentence? Let's give a couple examples. Let's listen to a sentence. When circumstances become difficult, determined people start taking action. So this sentence is grammatically solid, but it's not necessarily memorable or quotable. If I asked you to quote it, you'd have to ask me, will we repeat it a couple more times maybe, and then I can quote it. However, the original sentence went like this, and I bet you if I start it, you guys can finish it, at least most of you. Are you ready? When the going gets tough, the tough get going, right? Both those sentences said the same thing. Why is one more quotable and rememberable than the other? Because one is a balanced sentence and the other's not. All right, well, let's go to the other one. The original, again, states the same ideas. When the circumstances become difficult, determined people start taking action. That's what he's saying, right? But that's not how he said it. John F. Kennedy says, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And it's easy to remember, it's easy to repeat, and it brings across the idea in almost a kind of sort of a poetic, memorable way. So it has a more distinctive resonance, it has a more distinctive rhythm, and a more distinctive style. It makes it stand out. We remember and return to it because it achieves emphasis through a very personal form, or a form that's easy to remember. So what is a balanced sentence? A balanced sentence is this. It applies similar structures that are equal in length and proportion. So one part of the sentence matches or balances out with the second half of the sentence. When the going gets tough, now you can immediately append the rest of it. The tough get going. It's almost like a flip-flop. So it balances. Each side of that sentence is equal. All right, so we remember that stuff. Let's give a couple more examples. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Right? That is a balanced sentence. We can remember it. And most of these balanced sentences, you could actually just start the first half, and even if a person's never really heard the second half, they can kind of sort of guess, if they follow the pattern, what would go next, okay? So how about this one? This was actually a potato chips commercial, and it's been altered over the years, but this was the original. Can't live with them, can't live without them, right? And how about this one? And lead us not into temptation. Do you recognize this in English? That's a balanced sentence. There's a purpose. Jesus was using a balanced sentence in the Greek, and in its translation, it works as a balanced sentence in English. So this kind of balanced sentence is what we call an antithesis balanced sentence. So what is an antithesis balanced sentence? Well, that kind of a sentence features two contrasting ideas. Each are opposite and yet equal in structure and importance and in meaning. And you can get the meaning from one half of the sentence by understanding the meaning in the other half of the sentence. So how do we understand a balanced sentence in Jesus' meaning? Well, we can use the second half of the sentence to understand the first. So, for example, deliver us from evil is the second half. The word evil is the word poneros, and it means that which is wicked. Therefore, the first part must mean, if it's deliver us from that which is wicked, the first part must mean don't let us go, or don't allow us to be tempted by wicked. Instead, deliver us from wicked. See the balance? If the sentence was not balanced, it'd be harder to understand. But because he's using a balanced sentence, the second half clarifies the first half. In other words, the word lead here is not being used by Jesus to imply that God brings temptation our way. But it is being used as an antithesis to the word deliver in the second half of the sentence. In other words, Jesus is saying that God has the power over the actual tempter and temptation itself. So even Satan, God has power over, because he's the tempter. Even though many temptations can come from within ourselves, Satan definitely brings that or uses our weaknesses and can tempt us outwardly. And here, what Jesus is telling us to do is we are to call on God and ask him to deliver us, not just forgive us for our sins, but deliver us from temptation itself. So you could change the word lead into, and do not let us fall into temptation, but instead deliver us from wickedness, which is the same thing. But because of the Greek day and the time that Jesus was speaking and the type of balanced sentence that he was doing, a lot of play on words, it didn't necessarily translate so well into English. But his meaning does, especially if you break down its grammar and understand how a balanced sentence is designed to work.
Leads me to as I was thinking, whenever we do run across a particular passage that seems to be contrasting what is said in other passages, then we rely on the nature of God, what his word is about, and we search diligently to find out why. And just like you explained that particular verse, there's a deeper way, because we know that he's not leading us into temptation
Right.
and so forth. And so you know the very nature of God and what his desire is from other scripture. So there's got to be a way to describe that or to define that. And
Yep.
then that's when we dig deep in to find out, okay, what you've brought out tonight is a very fine example of that. But anytime we come across something that seems to be contradictory, we know God doesn't contradict himself, and his word is not infallible, and it's reliable, and so forth. And so we have to figure out from other scriptures, then we
Yep.
know there's a deeper meaning to it. So we know we're not going to, no, it's not going to be a contradiction once we get to the bottom of it.
And actually, we're going to do exactly what you just said. Because the next question is, does the rest of the Bible support this interpretation, what I just said? And the answer is, yes, it does. So, in fact, Jesus himself supports it. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 41, this is in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's right before he's about to be arrested and tried and brutally beaten and tortured and crucified. In Matthew 26:41, he tells the disciples something that sounds very familiar. He says, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation." He says, "The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." So does he say, watch and pray that God won't lead you into temptation? No, he's really kind of clarifying. He's saying the same thing. Pray that you don't enter into temptation is his prayer for the disciples right before, as he's praying in agony in the garden because he knows what he's about to face. And then we can look at Luke 22:40, and Luke writes this same part of Jesus' experience, and he writes this particular verse. And he says, and Luke writes it in this way, "And when he came to the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.'" And it's used twice in Luke, actually. A little bit later on, they fall asleep, and Jesus is still praying in the garden, and they still don't get what's happening, and Jesus is prepping for this experience that no human being should ever have to go through. But he knew it was necessary to rescue his people. And he comes back and finds them sleeping. And what does he do? He wakes them up. And what does he say? "Pray that you do not enter into temptation." So he does it twice in Luke. So Jesus uses this kind of language in Matthew, he uses it in Mark, and he uses it twice in a row in Luke. And in 1 Corinthians 10:13, we get the same concept. Of course, it's Paul writing, and he writes, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. Now notice this verse is the verse that often gets misquoted, because I've heard a lot of Christians say, God won't let me handle anything that I can't bear. He won't allow trials to be greater than I can handle. And that's not what the Bible says. The Bible is not talking about trials, it's talking about temptations. So he says, God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. So not only are we taught that we can pray for temptation to not occur in our lives, we're given that in the Lord's Prayer, and then Jesus teaches the disciples towards the end. We're also taught that when temptation does come into our lives, eventually God will faithfully give us a way to escape it so that we don't have to fall into sin. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy, because a temptation is still a temptation. It's a desire to do something we know we probably shouldn't. And so, as we close off this particular long series on the Lord's Prayer in the 7/8 attitudes that Jesus is teaching his disciples, we need to know that Jesus is letting us into the throne room of grace, and we can go before the Father, and we can pray to not enter into temptation. We can pray for temptation to cease. But we can also understand that if temptation comes, if the Lord sometimes says no, that when we are tempted, we have a faithful God who will always give us a way out and the power to escape when we are tempted, so that we don't fall into sin. So that is the last of this series. We've finished up the attitudes of prayer. And we'll go ahead and we'll close. I'm not exactly sure what series we'll start. I've got a couple of ideas next time, but we'll see what it is. I'll introduce it at the beginning of next session. Pastor, will you close?